Welcome. Today we're exploring an ancient Roman festival, Saturnalia. It was this big celebration in December honoring the god Saturn.
Right, and finding out exactly what happened means looking at quite a few different ancient writings because, well, no single author really lays it all out for us. Macrobius, though, he's a major source. He gives us a lot of insight.
So Saturn himself, what was his story in Roman belief?
Well, fundamentally, he was seen as a god of agriculture. But there's also this powerful myth associating him with a past golden age.
Ah, yes, the Golden Age, a time with no hard work, everything shared, that kind of thing.
Exactly, a sort of mythical utopia. And interestingly, there's also a version where he's depicted as a foreign king, an immigrant almost, who came to Italy after Jupiter overthrew him back in Greece, and he was welcomed by the god Janus.
Interesting mix. So our goal here is really to unpack what Saturnalia was all about, what its key parts were, and why it mattered to the Romans, and maybe even beyond.
Precisely, to understand its significance.
Okay, let's start with where it came from, its origins.
Well, Saturnalia wasn't created in a vacuum. It seems to have clear links to an earlier Greek festival, the Chronia.
Chronia, celebrating Kronos, the Greek equivalent of Saturn.
Exactly. Both honored that Titan figure. And while the timing was different, Chronia was usually midsummer, Saturnalia midwinter, there are definite parallels.
And it wasn't just Greece, right? Weren't there similar festivals elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. You see hints of similar customs across the Greco-Roman world. There was the Hermaia in Crete, festivals mentioned in places like Troezen and Thessaly, even suggestions of something similar way off in Babylon. And that really intriguing custom, the one where masters might dine with or even serve their slaves, that pops up in other Greek contexts too, like the Anthesteria or the Hyacinthia. It suggests a wider cultural pattern of temporary social inversion during certain religious times.
So this need for, I suppose, a temporary release valve wasn't uniquely Roman. It tells you something about social structures and maybe human nature itself.
It certainly seems that way, these sanctioned moments of letting go.
But the Romans put their own stamp on it, didn't they? There was a specific moment when Saturnalia really changed shape.
Yes. A really crucial point was after a major Roman military disaster, the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, during the war against Hannibal.
Okay, so what happened?
Before that, Saturnalia was likely celebrated in a more traditional Roman way. But after the defeat, they consulted the Sibylline books, their sacred prophetic texts, and the recommendation was to adopt what they called the Greek Rite.
The Greek Rite.
And this seems to be when elements like the big public banquets became standard, and also that famous shout, Io Saturnalia, became integral to the whole thing.
Right.
There's also a pretty interesting theory, though debated, that some later customs might show influence from the Carthaginian god Baal-Hamon, whom the Romans often equated with Saturn.
Baal-Hamon, how so?
Well, the idea is that maybe practices like master serving slaves were extended, perhaps initially, to Carthaginian prisoners of war as a kind of appeasement or integration after the Punic Wars. It's speculative, but plausible.
That's quite a thought. So let's move on to the public side of things.
Yeah.
What did the actual religious rituals involve?
The focal point was the Temple of Saturn, right there in the Roman Forum. Now, usually, the cult statue of Saturn inside had its feet bound with wool strips.
Why?
It's debated, perhaps symbolizing control over his potentially chaotic power, or maybe linking him to the Earth's constraints. But for Saturnalia, these wool bindings were ceremonially untied, a symbolic liberation for the god, mirroring the liberation felt by the people.
I see. And the sacrifice.
That was done according to this adopted Greek rite. A key difference was the priest performing the sacrifice would have his head uncovered, unlike the traditional Roman practice where priests covered their heads with their toga.
Why the change?
It could be simply reflecting Saturn's identification with the Greek Kronos, or maybe it was another deliberate reversal, part of the Saturnalian theme of turning things upside down. After the sacrifice, the Senate sponsored Electisternium.
Electisternium, that's like a banquet for the gods.
Essentially, yes. An image or symbol of the god was placed on a dining couch, as if joining the feast. And this was followed by a large public banquet for the people.
Sounds like a major public event. The whole city must have shifted gear.
It really did. Saturnalia was a public holiday, all business stopped. No work, schools closed, training grounds were empty, the law courts were shut. No judgments passed, no contracts enforced. You couldn't even declare war.
Wow. A complete pause.
A complete pause for the official start. Then, the private celebrations would continue in homes for the next couple of days, also typically free from public business. Families would often start the day with an early bath and, if they could afford it, sacrifice a suckling pig. That was a fairly common offering for earth deities.
You mentioned Saturn's power earlier. He wasn't just a jolly harvest god, was he? There was a darker side.
No, you're absolutely right. He had associations that were less comfortable. One consort mentioned is Lua, sometimes identified with Lua Mater, a goddess linked to, well, destruction and expiation. Enemy weapons captured in war were sometimes burned in her honor.
Destruction.
And Saturn's connection to the earth, to things hidden beneath, also linked him to the underworld and its god, Dis Pater, the Roman Pluto, who was also, significantly, a god of wealth, hidden in the earth.
Okay, so wealth in the underworld, that sounds like a potent mix.
It is, and this connection possibly leads us to one of the more disturbing aspects sometimes associated with the Saturnalia period.
Which is?
Gladiatorial games, the Manera.
Ah, held during Saturnalia.
We're very close to it, yes. From about the 3rd century AD, we see evidence of gladiators being presented essentially as offerings during the December Games, often funded from the state treasury, which, remember, was housed in Saturn's temple.
And this was controversial even then.
Christian writers certainly condemned it later, framing it explicitly as human sacrifice. Now, we don't have direct evidence of human sacrifice as part of Saturnalia during the Republic or early Empire, but these later gladiatorial offerings fueled ancient theories that the earliest forms of Saturn worship had involved human victims.
Really? What kind of theories?
Macrobius mentions myths claiming that originally human heads were offered to Dis Pater and actual men were sacrificed to Saturn. There's a story that Hercules, when he came through Italy, put a stop to it.
Hercules again, sorting things out. So how do they stop it, according to the myth?
By substituting symbolic offerings. Instead of real heads for Dis Pater, they were told to offer oscilla, little masks or effigies, often hung on trees. And for Saturn, because the Greek word photo could mean both man and lights, wax candles became the symbolic substitute, representing the light of life.
Candles. And that connects to the gift-giving, too, doesn't it? The sigillaria.
Exactly. Those small figurines, often pottery or wax, that were exchanged as gifts, the sigillaria, might also be seen as part of this shift away from literal sacrifice towards symbolic representation. It shows how Roman religion could adapt and reinterpret older, perhaps more brutal traditions.
That's a fascinating evolution. Okay, let's shift to the private parties, the bit people often think of first, the role reversal. Tell us more about that.
This is probably the most famous aspect, isn't it? The temporary flipping of the social hierarchy. Slaves, for this short period, got a taste of freedom.
How did that work in practice? Did masters really serve their slaves?
The accounts vary a bit. Some say masters served the slaves, others suggest they simply dined together, perhaps with the slaves eating first. It probably wasn't uniform everywhere or every year, and likely changed over time. But the core idea was this December liberty, as the poet Horace called it.
Liberty to do what, exactly?
To speak freely, primarily. Slaves could apparently joke with, criticize, even mildly disrespect their masters without the usual fear of punishment. You see this reflected in literature, like Horace's satires, where a slave gets quite philosophical and critical with his master during the festival.
But everyone knew it was temporary.
Oh, absolutely. That was crucial. It was a licensed, contained period of inversion. Once Saturnalia ended, the normal, very rigid social order snapped right back into place. It was a safety valve, perhaps, not a revolution.
It makes you think about how societies manage dissent, doesn't it? Even by allowing it briefly.
Precisely. Acknowledging the tension, perhaps, by playfully releasing it.
And this festive freedom was reflected in what people wore, too, right? No stuffy togas.
Definitely not. The formal toga, the everyday symbol of Roman citizenship for men, was put away. Instead, people wore colorful, informal Greek-style dinner clothes, the synthesis even during the day, which would normally be quite improper.
A more relaxed look.
Much more relaxed. And crucially, everyone, citizens and slaves alike, wore the pileus.
The pileus, that's the conical felt cap.
Yes, the cap traditionally given to slaves when they were formally freed. During Saturnalia, everyone wore it. Citizens who normally went bareheaded put it on. Slaves who normally couldn't wear it put it on. It was a visual symbol of that temporary equality, erasing the usual distinctions marked by dress.
What about women? How do they fit into these private celebrations?
The sources aren't always explicit, but we know gifts were exchanged for women, which clearly implies their participation. Whether they attended the main banquets probably depended on the specific household and the changing social norms. Women became more publicly visible in social settings over time, especially from the late Republic onwards.
Any other signs of their involvement?
We hear about female entertainers, musicians, and dancers being present at some parties, and the whole atmosphere of role-playing and disguise during Saturnalia might have allowed for more freedom generally. There are even hints of mask wearing, though it's not definitively tied to theatrical performance in the same way as other festivals. Some scholars see echoes of the Saturnalian spirit, impudent slaves, slightly chaotic seniors in Roman comedy plays.
It sounds like things could get pretty rowdy. What other activities were common, beyond the feasting and the role play?
Oh, certainly. Gambling, for instance. Normally, gambling with dice was illegal, or at least heavily frowned
But
upon.
not during Saturnalia.
Nope. During Saturnalia, the rules were relaxed. Everyone, including slaves, was allowed to gamble, usually playing with dice or sometimes nuts for stakes. There's even an image from the calendar of Philocalus showing a man at a gaming table with the caption, "Now you have licensed slave to game with your master."
So gambling, feasting,
Yeah.
what else?
Overindulgence was pretty much the norm. Lots of eating, lots of drinking. Sobriety seems to have been the exception. The philosopher Seneca wrote about bracing himself for the noise and bustle of the city during the festival, the general loosening of conduct. Some, like Pliny the Younger, apparently found it all a bit much and retreated to a quiet study in their villa.
I can imagine. And then, of course, the presents. Gift-giving seems central.
Very central, especially around the day called Sigillaria, which fell on December 19th. This day was particularly focused on gift exchange.
What kind of gifts? Were they expensive?
Often, deliberately not. To keep with the spirit of temporary equality, gifts were frequently simple and inexpensive. Those pottery or wax figurines, the sigillaria, were common. Wax candles, cerae, were another typical gift, linking back to that symbolism of light we discussed. Gag gifts were popular too. Emperor Augustus was apparently fond of giving them. Children usually received toys.
But not always cheap gifts.
No, the poet Martial gives lists that include everything from writing tablets, nuts, dice, and combs to pets, cooks, or even slaves. But he also emphasizes that a simple, inexpensive gift could be a token of genuine friendship. Wealthier patrons might also give their poorer clients a sum of money, a sigillaricium, specifically to help them buy gifts for the festival.
And sometimes they came with little poems.
Yes, verses often accompanied the gifts, a bit like modern greeting cards, adding a personal touch.
Now, what about this king of the Saturnalia figure?
Ah, the Saturnalicious Princeps, the ruler of the Saturnalia. He sounds like quite a character.
How was he chosen?
Usually by lot, often by throwing dice from among the guests at a private feast or gathering. This figure seems more prominent in accounts from the imperial period.
And what did this king do?
He acted as a sort of master of ceremonies for the party, but with a twist. His role was to issue absurd or comical commands that the other guests had, to obey things like singing badly, dunking someone in cold water, telling embarrassing stories. It created this temporary, chaotic little kingdom within the feast.
A bit like the medieval Lord of Misrule.
Exactly. That's the most common comparison. Some scholars even think the Saturnalicious princeps might have emerged partly as a kind of gentle satire of the real princeps, the emperor, whose single word held so much power. It was a playful mockery of absolute authority. Even the Emperor Nero is said to have played this role when he was young.
Fascinating. And finally, that shot we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Io Saturnalia.
Yes, you Saturnalia. That was the signature sound of the festival. You'd hear it everywhere. It apparently started after the public banquet on the first day, December 17th, and just continued.
What does Io actually mean?
It's an interjection, a ritual exclamation expressing strong emotion, joy, triumph, religious fervor. It was used in celebrating military victories or honoring Bacchus. But during Saturnalia, it was just the sound of celebration, punctuating jokes, and general revelry.
So a sound of pure, uninhibited joy. Let's talk about the timing. How did Saturnalia fit into the Roman calendar year?
Okay, so originally on the old Roman calendar, before Julius Caesar reformed it, Saturnalia was celebrated on the 14th day before the calends of January. That specific date, December 17th, in our terms eventually, was also the anniversary of the dedication of the Temple of Saturn back in 497 BC.
So the temple anniversary was key. What happened after Caesar's calendar reform?
Caesar added days to the months, including December. This shifted the position of the original Saturnalia date relative to the end of the month. The festival itself stayed on December 17th, but now it was technically the 16th day before the calends of January.
Did that cause confusion?
It seems so. People felt the holiday had somehow moved. To address this, the Emperor Augustus officially extended the public holiday to 3 days, December 17th, 18th, and 19th, effectively covering both the old and new relative positions.
And the private partying went on even longer.
Yes, by the late Republic, the private festivities, the feasting and gift-giving, often stretched out for a full 7 days. Later, during the Empire, it seems to have contracted slightly, maybe to 3 or 5 days, depending on the source and period.
You mentioned the solstice earlier. Was there an astrological connection too?
There was. December 17th marked the beginning of the astrological sign Capricorn, which was considered the house of the planet Saturn. And its proximity to the winter solstice, the shortest day, around December 21st to 23rd on their calendar, was definitely noted.
Leading to interpretations about light returning.
Precisely. The widespread use of candles and torches during Saturnalia was often interpreted in antiquity as symbolizing the rebirth of the sun's light after the darkness of the solstice. Light conquering darkness.
Beyond the rituals and parties, how did ancient thinkers understand the deeper meaning of Saturnalia? What were the Roman theological views?
For the Romans themselves, Saturnalia really embodied Saturn's dual nature. On one hand, he represented that golden age, joyful abundance, prosperity, ease. His consort Ops, her name literally meaning wealth or plenty, reinforces this. And remember, the state treasury, the aerarium, was physically located in his temple.
So wealth and good times. But the darker side, too.
Yes, that undercurrent was always there. The potential for chaos, the links to the underworld through Dies Pater, the memory, perhaps, of older, harsher rites. Saturn's identity was complex. He was both this ancient, native Italian ruler from the mythical past and somehow an outsider, a fugitive king from Greece, whose arrival overturned the existing order and brought civilization, specifically agriculture. This duality perhaps made him the perfect figurehead for a festival that was all about temporarily overturning the social order.
And what about later philosophers? Did they add their interpretations?
They did. The Neoplatonists, for example, offered more allegorical readings. Porphyry, writing in the 3rd century A.D., saw Saturnalia's liberation, the untying of the god's feet, the freeing of slaves as symbolizing the freeing of souls into immortality.
Souls escaping bondage.
That seems to be the idea. It's an interpretation that might have resonated particularly well within mystery cults, like Mithraism, which often had many followers among slaves and freedmen. Porphyry also connected the festival's timing near the solstice, when the sun enters Capricorn, Saturn's house, to this idea of spiritual ascent or liberation.
And Macrobius, our key source, picked up on the solstice connection too.
Very much so. In his work Saturnalia, the discussion explicitly links the festival's timing to the solstice and uses it as a launching point to talk about solar theology. The idea, popular in late antiquity, that the sun, Sol, was the supreme deity encompassing all others.
It's always interesting to see how contemporary cultures viewed these Roman practices. Were there, say, Jewish perspectives on Saturnalia?
Yes, there were. Rabbinic texts from the period, like the Mishnah tractate Avodah Zarah, which deals with interactions with non-Jews, explicitly lists Saturnalia and the calends of January as festivals of the Gentiles, during which certain kinds of business dealings were restricted.
So, acknowledged but kept at arm's length.
Pretty much. The Babylonian Talmud offers a really fascinating and quite different origin story for Saturnalia and kalends. It attributes them to Adam, the first man.
How?
The story goes that after the expulsion from Eden, Adam saw the days getting shorter and shorter as winter approached. He became terrified, thinking the world was ending, returning to darkness and chaos as punishment for his sin. He fasted and prayed for 8 days. Then, when he saw the winter solstice pass and the days begin to lengthen again, he realized it was just the natural cycle of the world.
So he celebrated.
He celebrated with 8 days of feasting. According to this Talmudic passage, these were the origins of the festivals that later Gentiles, through idolatry, dedicated to Saturnalia and kalends. It's a way of explaining the festivals while simultaneously reclaiming their ultimate origin within a Jewish framework and critiquing their current pagan practice.
That's quite an interpretation.
The Jerusalem Talmud offers a different, rather pointed etymology for Saturnalia, suggesting it derives from Hebrew words meaning hidden hatred, linking it to the perceived enmity between Esau, often identified with Rome, and Jacob, representing Israel. So, quite different takes, but showing awareness of the festival.
Fascinating perspectives. Finally, let's talk about the legacy. Saturnalia clearly had staying power, didn't it? It didn't just disappear when the Western Roman Empire faded.
Not at all. Because it was so focused on private domestic celebration rather than being tied solely to temples in Rome, it seems to have been very widespread across the empire. And it continued, perhaps in a more secular form, long after paganism was officially suppressed.
And its influence on later winter festivals, particularly Christmas, seems undeniable.
The parallels are certainly striking, and many scholars argue for direct influence, though the exact lines can be hard to trace definitively. That medieval Christmas custom we mentioned, the Lord of Misrule, elected to preside over festive chaos in wealthy households, schools, and inns across Western Europe that looks very much like a continuation of the Saturnalicious Princeps.
What about the date of Christmas itself, December 25th?
That's a complex debate. But one strong possibility is that the date was chosen, at least in part, to provide a Christian alternative to popular existing pagan festivals around the winter solstice, namely Saturnalia, and, perhaps even more significantly by the 4th century, the festival of Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquerable sun, which was celebrated on December 25th.
So, co-opting the timing.
Potentially. We know early church figures like Tertullian were actually quite critical of Christians who seemed to be slipping back into pagan habits by celebrating Saturnalia with feasting and gift-giving. It suggests the popular pull of these traditions was strong.
And did specific Saturnalian customs pop up in medieval Christmas celebrations?
Absolutely. You see many of the same ingredients. Widespread revelry, heavy eating and drinking, gambling, sometimes even the role reversal elements. The tradition of the boy bishop in parts of France and Switzerland, where a child was elected bishop for a short period and issued mock decrees, clearly echoes the king of Saturnalia. There were even instances, condemned by church authorities, of clergy engaging in mask-wearing or cross-dressing during the Christmas season festivities again, that Saturnalian spirit of inversion.
The Feast of Fools, that kind of thing.
Yes, the Feast of Fools, often held around January 1st, shared many of these characteristics. And traditions like the king or queen of the bean, chosen by finding a bean hidden in a cake on Twelfth Night Epiphany, also seem to carry echoes of the Saturnalian lottery for the master of ceremonies.
But these traditions faced pushback, didn't they?
They did, particularly during and after the Protestant Reformation. Puritans in England, for example, strongly objected to these popish Christmas customs, viewing them as remnants of paganism and disorder. They famously tried to suppress Christmas celebrations altogether during the Commonwealth period in the 17th century.
But the traditions didn't completely die out?
No, though they were certainly toned down. Some aspects, like gift-giving, feasting, and caroling, persisted or were later revived, especially in the 19th century, often reframed within a more domestic, family-focused vision of Christmas.
So when we look at modern Christmas, can we still see faint traces of Saturnalia?
I think you can. The emphasis on gift-giving, while it has its own Christian justifications, certainly resonates with the Roman practice of exchanging sigillaria. The use of lights, Advent candles, Christmas lights echoes the Roman use of torches and wax tapers, perhaps tapping into that ancient symbolism of light returning at the solstice. And of course, the general festive atmosphere of eating, drinking, parties, time off work. It all feels connected to that very old tradition of midwinter license and celebration.
So pulling it all together, Saturnalia was this incredibly rich, complex festival. It's about revelry and release, yes, but also about religious duty, social commentary through inversion, and strengthening bonds through gift-giving.
Exactly. It was deeply embedded in Roman ideas about their mythical past, about Saturn and his golden age, but it also clearly evolved over centuries, absorbing influences and changing its shape.
It seems to have held so many layers of meaning for people at the time celebrating harvests and wealth, sure, but also maybe symbolizing a deeper desire for freedom, for equality, even if only temporary, and that powerful symbolism of light returning in the darkest part of the year.
It truly did. It combined public ritual with very personal, private celebration in a way that clearly resonated deeply across Roman society for a very long time.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How much of these ancient ways of marking time, of celebrating release and renewal around the winter solstice, still linger, perhaps unconsciously, in our own modern customs and traditions today? What parts of that ancient Roman chaos and joy still echo?